There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another In Other Words. This is an occasional series where I talk about phrases, words, expressions, occasionally grammatical patterns that I encounter in my reading. And so I have, I think, a half dozen or so for you today. This is the last batch that I'm going to do from my 2020 list. I'm filming this in March 2021. I don't know when you'll see it. I make notes on at least 100 words every year, and I don't have time to make In Other Words videos that often, so this is the last batch from my 2020 list, and the next one you see is from my 2021 reading. Isn't that exciting? Okay, so this is selections from books I read at various points last year. The first one is from Barbara Pym's last published novel, An Academic Question. And there is a phrase in it, it's one of my least favorite of her novels, my very least favorite of her novels, but that's neither here nor there. And somebody says, after all, nature isn't always red in tooth and claw. I could guess from the context what it meant, but it's a phrase that refers to the violent natural world. Red, bloody, red in tooth and claw. In fact, it comes from the famous Tennyson poem about his friend Arthur H. Hallam called In Memoriam A.H.H. from 1850. It's in Canto 56. Canto means verse, does it? I don't know much about poetry, but Canto 56. It's a very long poem. I haven't read it. Have you? Goes something like this, as they say. Talking about man. Who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law. Though nature, red in tooth and claw, with ravine shrieked against his creed. I don't understand that, and I'm not here to gloss this canto, but that's where the phrase originated. That's when the phrase came into English language, although the phrase tooth and claw, the shorter phrase, tooth and claw, was already circulating. In fact, the man that this poem was written for, Arthur Hallam, he used the phrase. So it's the conflict between love and human selfishness, but actually tooth and claw, the wildness of the natural world. The longer phrase, red in tooth and claw, I believe Darwin used it in his book, but certainly when people talk about evolution and the natural world, it's a phrase that was circulating a lot at that time, and more recently, Richard Dawkins used it in his book, The Selfish Gene. And one, I think I've done a few from this fabulous novel by Elizabeth Bowen, The Last September, originally published in 1929. The word is effrontery. It's a word I knew. I vaguely understood the meaning, but often it's not that I don't know what the word means, but that I put it on the list because I want to know what's the etymology, why does it mean that. So, effrontery. As a speaker of North American English, it's a word that doesn't sound like a very good word. It sounds kind of bloated and a word we don't really need anymore, but it means shamelessness, impudence, boldness, audaciousness. And it comes from the French effrontery, which meant shameless, and it goes back to Old French, and then late Latin there was a variation with the same meaning, an F being a version of the prefix X, which means out, and frontum, meaning brow. So, brow out. And ultimately, the root here is the word front. So, the word front has been in English since the 13th century, and it comes from the old French word front, which meant forehead or brow, going back to the same Latin roots, and has been used in English to also talk about the facade of a building, external appearance, vanguard. And I am confused by this fact, and I'm not going to do any more of a deep dive now, but maybe you guys can take this a bit further. But the etymology of the word front is not as certain as the etymology I just shared with you of effrontery, going back to the Latin frontum, which meant brow. Front, as I said, goes back to the Latin word frontum, which means brow. Beyond that, they have two possible Proto-Indo-European roots that it may have come from. One is ser, meaning above over, up, upper, in the foremost part of something. But the other one is bhront, here it is, which means to project or stand out. Interestingly, there was a word in English, I've never heard of it in modern times, but it was in vogue in the 14th century, frontless, which meant shameless. So there's that idea that we have in effrontery about being shameless. Effrontery and frontless. And yes, the similar word affront is definitely etymologically part of the same word family. So affront means to offend by open disrespect. And the old French verb affronter means to slap in the face. Going back to the late Latin affronter, to strike against, and also going back to that forehead Latin root. So it's all one big, rather unhappy, rather audacious, if not rude, word family. The next one comes from a short story in this collection by Annie Poole. Fine just the way it is. I wasn't that impressed with the collection overall, but the story in question is Them Old Cowboy Songs, and it's 6 months or more since I read it. I think this was one of the ones I liked. But anyway, the phrase is metes and bounds, and it's a young married couple in the countryside of one of the western states. And I don't remember which one, but it's in the American West in the 1880s. And the young married couple have just bought a homestead. Homestead, hold that thought, homestead, to the end of the video. And this is very sweet. Archie bought 80 acres of homestead. Let me read you a few sentences, because it's quite a sweet passage. And it was immediately theirs with no strings attached, the land, the 80 acres. Archie, thrilled to be a landowner, told Rose, his bride, his new wife, he had to sing the metes and bounds. He started on the southwest corner and headed east. It was something he reckoned had to be done. Rose walked along with him at the beginning and even tried to sing with him, but got out of breath from walking so fast and singing at the same time. Nor did she know the words to many of his songs. Archie kept going. It took him hours. Late in the afternoon, he was on the west line, drawing near and still singing, though his voice was raspy. And we'll go downtown and we'll buy some shirts. And slouching down the slope the last 100 feet in the evening dusk, so worn of voice she could hardly hear him breathily half chant, Never had a nickel and I don't give a shit. Okay, so metes and bounds, I didn't know. And this is a system, an ancient system of describing land, describing property, real estate. Very ancient, used in Britain, and was used in the 13 colonies, apparently still used in the province of Ontario in Canada. I can hardly believe it. It's still used in Zimbabwe, India, Bangladesh, but originated in Britain. And this system of describing the boundaries, metes and bounds, of land was based on a system of using physical features of the local geography, as well as directions and distances. It was a very elaborate, prosy way of describing the boundaries of land. Somebody will tell me, because I'm not sure if it's still being used in the UK, is it? Somebody will tell me. So metes means a boundary defined by the measurement of each straight run. So that's a distance between terminal points and an orientation or direction. Whereas bounds is a more general description where you're using more words, not just measurement of distances to describe the boundaries. So here's an example of the metes and bounds of a small parcel of land. Commencing at a corner at the intersection of two stone walls near an apple tree on the north side of Muddy Creek Road, 1 mile above the junction of Muddy and Indian Creeks. Thence north for 150 rods to the end of the stone wall bordering the road, thence northwest along a line to a large standing rock on the corner of the property now or formerly belonging to John Smith, and so on. Okay, so you can see the metes and the bounds. The metes being the measurements and the distances and the directions, and all the other more wordy descriptions being the bounds. Fascinating. And then I found, just before I pushed record on my iPad to make this video, that corresponding to this, there is a tradition in the UK and still in parts, I believe, of America, of beating the bounds. And beating the bounds, also called perambulating, walking around the bounds, is an ancient custom still observed in parts of England, Wales, and the New England region of America, which involves swatting. I don't know if they use a broom or whatever. I'm going to put a video in if it's not copyrighted. No, I looked. I think that the videos, you have to be really interested to watch them, but if you go onto YouTube and search for beating the bounds, you will find many examples, old and new. But you walk around and you swat local landmarks with branches to maintain a shared mental map of parish boundaries, usually done every 7 years. And there is one little parish in the UK, and there are videos going back to the 70s and every 7 years up to now, and it's just a bunch of the people in the community walking around together, laughing and stuff, and yeah, it's quite the thing. And in fact, that was what this farmer in this story was kind of doing. He was singing the metes and bounds, so it's very similar, eh? So let's look at the two nouns. Mete, as a verb, means to allot. It comes from Old English, West Saxon, meaning measure, ascertain the dimension or quantity of something, compare something, estimate. It goes back to Proto-Germanic, Norse, Dutch, Old High German, and ultimately goes back to a Proto-Indo-European root, med, which means to take appropriate measures. And so you probably know the verb mete. It's still used. It's an old-fashioned word that we still use to mete out punishment, to impose a punishment, and it's all connected to that. So let's look at the Proto-Indo-European root, meaning to take appropriate measures. So to take so that's interesting. Let's think for a minute. To take appropriate measures means to take appropriate measurements, but also measures in actions. That is interesting. I didn't think of that until right now. If you're half as excited as I am right now, I guess this video is a success. But that Proto-Indo-European root, med, is the root of all of these words that we use. Accommodate, commodity, empty, moderate, immodest, medical. All the medication words. Meditate, meet, as in let's meet tomorrow. Modal, mode, model, moderate, modern, oh my god, modulate, mold, mood, remedial, and remedy. That is fascinating. Bound entered English around the year 1300, meaning boundary marker. Comes from the Anglo-Latin bunda, going back to Old French, medieval Latin. And obviously became a verb, meaning to form the boundary of something, to set a limit. Out of bounds, all those phrases, they all go back to that. They haven't gotten it back any further than medieval Latin. The rest of them come to us from Queen Mary. Not personally, but from her biography, one of the best books I read in 2020 by James Pope Hennessy. One is to give and gage. So Queen Mary's mother, the Duchess of Teck, was a piece of work. One of the most fascinating members of the royal family ever. And one of the things, she was a lovely woman that couldn't manage her money. And everybody else in the royal family was getting her to try to retrench and pay her bills and not buy so much on credit, but she just was hopeless. They actually sent the family, when Queen Mary, as Princess May, was a young woman, they sent her parents and all the kids to Europe to live a more restricted, restrained lifestyle. It didn't work very well because all the European royals just started giving Princess May's mother, the Duchess of Teck, money. But anyway, I digress. Don't get me started. But the phrase here is to give in gage. There was some things that were really valuable that Queen Mary's mother refused to pawn off, even though she was so broke. Give in gage means to pawn. Why? The noun gage meant, and these are archaic, I don't think they're used much anymore, but the archaic noun gage means a valued object deposited as a guarantee of good faith, and then came to mean more figuratively a pledge, especially a glove thrown down as a symbol of a challenge to fight. So promise or pledge, but a valued object. And then the verb gage meant to offer an object or offer one's life as a guarantee of good faith. I guess that phrase, on my life, would be a gage. The phrase to give in gage means to pawn your wedding ring or whatever, pawn the valuable item to get cash, right? So the noun gage has been around. The year 1300 was a big year for English, the English language, because the gage entered English that same year, meaning a pledge, a pawn, something valuable, deposited to ensure performance. This idea of throwing it down as a token of challenge. So there was a kind of a confrontational, I promise I'm going to kill you, or we have to have a fight or a duel, but also the other one is to make a more positive promise. Going back to Old French, Frankish, Proto-Germanic, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese all have variations of this word. We have to go to the Proto-Germanic root, wadi, here it is, and hold that thought for wadi, because that will get us back even further in this etymological family tree. But let's move, before we get there, let's look at engage. Had you already anticipated that engage means to make a promise, to get married? So, engage, or any kind of an engagement, a previous engagement, engagement to have lunch together, whatever. So, we've been using that verb in English since the early 15th century. Again, going back to French, the phrase engager, 2 words, engager, meant under pledge. And again, going back to Frankish and back to another Proto-Germanic root that I won't put on the screen because I don't want to make this unnecessarily complicated, but like a kissing cousin of the other one I just said. Also, the novel I'm reading is really engaging, holding my interest. It's occupying one's attention and so on. It's all connected, binding as a pledge. The specific sense of a promise to marry is from the decade of the 1610s. The sense of machinery being engaged, the telephone, that line is engaged, or whatever machinery you've got working at the moment, starts in 1884. I never would have thought of this, but the word wage is also a kissing cousin. To give something as surety, deposit as a pledge. So wage, the noun wage, 1300 again, a payment for services rendered, a reward, a salary. Going back to the same Proto-Germanic root, wadi, that we'll get to in a minute. About a century later, it also started to take on the connotation of a pledge, guarantee, or surety. So I said before we'd get back to this Proto-Germanic root, wadi. So that's what also gives us the verb wed, and then, of course, the noun wedding. So wed in English, it comes through Old English, Proto-Germanic, and so on, right back through the German languages to the Proto-Indo-European root, wad. Here it is, which means to pledge, to redeem a pledge. So what's this idea about engaged makes sense, and then wed, but the promise part of wed has to do with the dowry and all that. So giving a pledge or giving earnest money. So all of these verbs are kissing cousins. Engage, gage, newlywed, unwed, wage, wedding, wedlock. Woolsack. So Woolsack, I'm going to put a bunch of pictures up as I talk about this, is the Lord Chancellor's wool-stuffed seat in the House of Lords. So literally woolsack. You sit on the chair, which is upholstered with a literal wool-sack, wool-stuffed seat. It has been there. I assume they've reupholstered it. I don't know, but it's been part of the furniture of the House of Lords since the reign of Edward III, as a reminder of the importance to England of the wool trade. So woolsack comes exactly from that. It has become actually a reference to the Lord Chancellor over time. The woolsack is the Lord Chancellor. So just in case you're not if you need some brushing up on your British history, King Edward reigned from 1327 to 1377. So I hope it's been reupholstered. But that is where it comes from. There is one in the Irish House of Lords. The Canadian Senate used one until 1949. There's other stuff about the ceremony, the way it's used ceremonially and for the opening of Parliament that I think might be a little bit too far down in the weeds, but you can look that up. Much more fun and lighthearted, do you know what an apple pie bed is? This is an anecdote about the Prince of Wales in 1891. Do you know who the Prince of Wales was in 1891? Prince of Wales became Edward VII in 1901. So the Prince of Wales, he was not that young in 1891 because he was 59 10 years later. He was about 50 years old, and this is at the royal residence, the Sandringham estate. And the Prince of Wales himself, it says, would superintend the construction of apple pie beds, among other practical jokes. So the royals, at least in this generation, were notorious practical jokers. The apple pie bed is one of them. So, I'd never heard of that. It is what we would call short sheeting a bed, where you take a single sheet and you fold it so it appears to be the top and bottom sheet, but it's actually one single bed sheet folded over. So when you try to get into bed, you can't get in because it's, your legs only go halfway down the bed. Short sheeting or an apple pie bed. The origin of this is a little bit, nobody knows, but a fairly convincing theory, I think, is that there is a French phrase which means folded sheet. Let's see if I can get Google to give me correct pronunciation. So I'll put it up here in the corner and then look at how it's pronounced in French. I would never be able to do it.
Nappe.
Nappe. It means folded sheet or folded cloth.
Nappe.
But if you look at the spelling, you can kind of see apple in there. Like somebody that doesn't know French. Actually, you can kind of see apple and pie if you kind of have several glasses of wine and just kind of squish the words together and squint and squish the words together. Apple pie.
Nappe.
That's the best anybody's come up with. I found another thing that's interesting. There's another phrase. In fact, other people poo-poo that misreading of a French phrase because they say that nappe pliée, I can't pronounce it the way Google did, actually means a folded tablecloth, not a bed sheet. But anyway, they say no, much more is, if you think about an apple turnover, where if the pastry is folded over on itself to enclose the filling, they think that's maybe where it comes from. I don't know. Apple pie order. An apple pie order means perfect order or neatness. First used by a British Royal Navy officer, Sir Thomas Pasley, who died in 1808, in his journal in 1780. And they think that apple pie order means you're following to the letter a recipe on how to make an apple pie order, in the perfectly correct order. And the last one today is to stand in good stead. Actually, I think the phrase in Queen Mary's biography was to stand in admirable stead, but that phrase, to stand in good stead, is the most common one. I always kind of vaguely knew what it meant, but it actually means something will be very useful to someone in the future. Advantageous, useful. Something will stand you in good stead. My years of teaching stood me in good stead for my next career. So the noun stead means place, position, standing, firmness, stability, or fixity. Goes back to Proto-Germanic, Old Saxon, Old Norse, Swedish, Old High German, Gothic, and goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root, sta, which means to stand, make, or be firm. And yes, stand was slang for an erection way back in the day. So stand and stead are very closely related. The stead word family: bedstead, farmstead, homestead, right? Instead, in place of, stand, steadfast, steady. So let's look a little bit more closely at stand. The verb was entered English a bit earlier, 1300, there it is, to exist, to be present. By the late 16th century, it took on an additional meaning, which was to encounter without flinching, which very soon, within 50 years, took on the weaker sense of to put up with. So I guess can you stand it is this weaker meaning, isn't it? To stand for election, to submit to chance, meant to pay for as a treat. Yes, I've heard that meaning. Stand back, keep one's distance. It stands to reason. It's considered to be reasonable. It counts for reason. The noun, it's interesting. Usually I think nouns, I had always thought first we had nouns and then they became verbs, but obviously that's not true if I can believe what I have found online. So the noun stand entered about 100 years later, meaning a place of standing, a position. A raised platform for a hunter, bandstand, TV stand. The slang meaning that I said for an erection, 1867. The year of Canada's Confederation. Is that a coincidence? I think not. I have a page and a half of all the cognates, all the words that come from the same Proto-Indo-European root sta. Let me just give you a few. Afghanistan. Apostasy. Armistice. Assist. Constable. Consist. Cost. Epistemology. Estate. Insist, instant, obstetric, prostrate, stable, stage, static, station, stay, stem, stud, subsist, and there are dozens and dozens more. I hope this episode of In Other Words will put you in good stead for your future reading. Thanks for watching.